Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. And a little bit of what I'm going to say is a bit of review, but I guess at the end of a long day, it's not so bad to have a bit of revisiting some earlier thoughts. I'll be talking about prediction of plant traits and prediction of future climates in the context of an Earth system model. And acknowledging my co-authors here, and I'll point them out as we go through the contributions that they're making. In general, I'm assuming that there are a number of people here who understand quite well what an Earth system model does, and maybe others who are coming at it from a more basic understanding. And so I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking in general about the behavior of these models and a little bit of the history that Stephen actually already covered some of that, so this will be a bit of review. And then talk about why we are interested in using these models and what kind of predictions we're trying to get out of them. So the picture on the left there, I think, does a fine job of illustrating the system design that we're interested in here. We have, of course, the central location of the land. And in addition to all the fascinating biological and ecological traits represented by vegetation on the land, there's also all this other stuff around it. There's the atmosphere and the ocean. And we have sea ice. And we also have lots of land ice. And those turn out to be the major components of the Earth system model that all have to be coupled together to work in a relatively rapid time-stepping scheme, about every 20 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the spatial resolution of the model. You have to do a full simulation of all the physics and dynamics in the atmosphere and in the ocean on land, and step the model forward and be able to predict the evolution of the climate on that kind of a time scale. So it's a very challenging problem. It's very computationally expensive, and the land, as it turns out, is thankfully a very, very small part of the computational cost of these models. And so that means that we, unlike many of the other components of the models, are actually given quite a bit of latitude to kind of go crazy and explore wild ways of examining different parts of the ecosystems and how we might simulate them. But as I think Anna said, the one thing that you don't want to do is break the model in the process of all this crazy experimentation, because as soon as you do, then you've got the other 150 people in your project breathing down your neck to get you to fix it. So we're in some ways very lucky, but we also have to be very conservative. So we'll talk through some of the consequences of that. So without going into any of the details of what happens in the atmosphere and in the ocean and in the land ice and in the sea ice, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how the land has been represented as part of this Earth system, starting from the very early stages back in even before the 1960s, but really around in the mid-1960s is when this business got underway in a big way. And the land at that time was representing just a bottom boundary condition for the atmospheric circulation model. And that includes things like roughness for momentum transfer and reflectivity for shortwave energy, emissivity, wetness at the surface for water vapor transfer, and temperature for heat transfer. And remarkably, plant traits actually matter a lot from the very beginning for all of this, even though the physicists who were putting this all together didn't think of it that way. But the roughness is representation of vegetation height, the leaf spectra controlling a large fraction of the reflectivity over the vegetated part of the land area. Emissivity is dominated by fractional cover of leaf area versus non-leaf visible from the sky. Conductance is controlling the water vapor transfer, and as we've heard several times, leaf shape is a strong control on the temperature that the atmosphere sees on the land surface. So even from the very beginning, when there was no biology, really no land model per se in these models, just a bottom boundary condition with all of these things static, they were still traits as we describe them. I like Jens's description of traits as something, I'll see if I can get it, a quality connected to an entity. Yes, so thank you, Jens. I'm going to keep that one because that means just about everything, and so that's good. So our story gets really interesting. In 1986, when Piers Sellers and co-authors introduced the simple biosphere model, and so you might wonder what's the first thing that he was a physicist by training, but also very interested in biology. And you might wonder what's the first thing that gets introduced into this kind of a system when you start to introduce complexity on the land system. And that turns out to be stomates. And the picture on the right is showing Piers's conceptual diagram for what's included. And it's actually quite sophisticated. It includes multiple types of vegetation. This is community composition. We have stomates, we have the whole, actually much more sophisticated transfer of temperature in the canopy and below ground than we have, and latent heat flux than we have in many of the current generation of models. So this is very forward thinking. And on the right is a picture of what a stomate looks like, of course. I wish, Luke, that I could say that there were roots in this model, and even though there is somewhat of an extension of the plant below ground, alas, at this point, there really wasn't anything much like a root that was going on. But I'm going to take a little bit of an aside to say that one thing that I admire very much about everyone here is that they kind of put their bodies on the line when you go out and in pursuit of your science. And so Piers Sellers is a very extraordinary guy in that respect. In addition to leading campaigns in the field for boreas and fife in the tallgrass prairie, he was also an astronaut, and actually, and that's him up at the International Space Station. Lost Piers this past year to cancer. So, moving on. After the introduction of some basic biology, or actually kind of sophisticated treatment of plant traits like Piers brought in with SIB, the next step was to bring in predictions of how this system would respond to CO2, and that required a more sophisticated representation of the photosynthetic model, and of course, the Farquhar model, published in 1981, brought into these models in the mid-90s, and was pervasively used across all this class of model to estimate the connection between stomatoconductance, photosynthesis, and trying to use that to estimate both the influence of CO2 fertilization on sensible and latent heat fluxes, and then finally also to look at changes in the carbon cycle. I'll get to that in a second. One thing that I wanted to really stress for this group, because it may not be at all obvious, and it isn't true in every Earth system model, but it is true in many of the models that we use today, is that you might think that in an Earth system model, you have a grid cell represented by this collection of rectangles on the very top. And within that grid cell, you might imagine that there's one plant functional type, one PFT if it's the type of Earth system model which uses PFTs, which is to say all of them. But in the most sophisticated Earth system model, there's actually a whole nested hierarchy of subgrid modeling scales below that grid cell that allow us to capture the partition, the variance that we know happens inside these large grid cells, because even the highest resolution Earth system model that we can run is still going at a 10-kilometer resolution. That's extremely high resolution, and within that there's still lots of heterogeneity that we'd like to be able to capture. So this is the way we do it. The grid cells are broken up into chunks that represent, for example, this is one way that we do it, chunks that represent variation in geomorphology, or topographic variation within the grid cell. Those chunks can also be broken up and are broken up to represent different soils or different disturbance trajectories, and Rosie's presentation earlier touched on this as well. And then within that, there's the possibility to represent many different vegetation types, sharing space, competing for nutrients, water, light, and space on these soil columns. So just to put that in your mind, that there is actually a very sophisticated representation of the subgrid heterogeneity, or of the community, the potential community structures in these models already. So what I want to do next is just talk a little bit about motivation for why I use these models for the research that I'm doing. And it really is a very focused purpose for the model. And my philosophy is that there are thousands of different models that you could be using, and depending on what it is that you want to do with the model, you would pick a different model to achieve your purpose. So my purpose for the work that I'm doing is to be able to predict future greenhouse gas concentrations and the climate change associated with those greenhouse gas concentrations, so that we understand what the climate looks like in the future on century kind of timescales. So of course the basic framework here is fossil fuel emissions influencing atmospheric CO2 concentration, influencing climate, and we'd like to know what this looks like 100 years from now, just for example. And in order to get a good estimation of that, what we understand now is that you have to include, for the carbon cycle, how the ocean and the land ecosystems and physical systems interact with the atmospheric CO2 in terms of fertilization, either physical or biological processes that are feedback processes that influence the atmospheric CO2 concentration. We've got a name for that, beta. There's also the feedback that goes between atmospheric CO2, changing climate, influencing the ocean, influencing the CO2 concentration that way, or alternatively through the land. We have a name for that, it's gamma. And when you put these things together, Pierre Friedlingstein in a series of papers made a very nice demonstration that you can linearize this whole system and get a great solution for what your future CO2 concentration looks like if you know these beta and gamma parameters, as well as a very important parameter that I won't talk about at all, which is the atmosphere's, the climate system sensitivity to CO2 concentration. So there's that. Left out of that picture, but also very important for the purpose of understanding plant traits, is this idea that there's also physical feedbacks or non-biological feedbacks maybe that operate. For example, if you took the influence of snowpack on shrub distributions in the Arctic, you have blowing wind, you have terrain, and you have accumulations of snow. Shrubs are preferentially being influenced by the availability of water from the melting snowpack, and then those shrubs themselves are influencing the accumulation of snow, which changes soil temperature, and so on and so on. So all of those feedbacks are part of this picture as well. And the last thing to point out here is that the fossil fuel emissions, of course, don't just show up. People put them there, and people also have a strong influence on the land system through land use and land cover change. And all of this stuff on the right feeds back to this people part. And a shameless plug for a new paper that we have out, which is actually putting this whole social system into the Earth system model as a fully coupled component of that. And it turns out to make a big difference. So check that out. One of the things that we discovered through this process of adding components to the Earth system model to be able to estimate the future CO2 concentrations and the climate change connected to that better was that in addition to the carbon cycle feedbacks that I just mentioned, where you have atmospheric CO2 potentially fertilizing plant growth, and the plant litter fall turning over through decomposition and respiration back to atmospheric CO2. There's another component of that system where, in this case, two important arrows have been left out. One is going here and one is going here, but we'll leave that aside. Having the nitrogen cycle connected to this picture has significant influence on both the beta and the gamma, and Anna pointed out an example of that as well, at least for the beta. My question was about the gamma. I'm still hoping to get in touch with you about that because I'm not quite sure I understand that. But what I'll just point out that based on the uncertainties that we have in terms of how those feedbacks play out at the large scale, at the global scale, over long periods of time, on this century kind of time scale, it's possible to have uncertainty in the final prediction of atmospheric CO2 concentrations, which are on the order of hundreds of parts per million of CO2, which is a big deal for the atmospheric concentration and the climate change related to that. So the IPCC has done a nice job now of evaluating, say, this beta response when you have changes in from a carbon-only system to a carbon-nitrogen system. We have the same response that Anna pointed out there in the earlier talk, that you have a reduction in the CO2 fertilization effect. And on the gamma side, which is usually a positive feedback, so warming without nitrogen is adding carbon to the atmosphere, tends to neutralize by having nitrogen, and that was the part that I was surprised I didn't see earlier. But we think this is a robust and general response. And so by going through this exercise of identifying something that was missing in the model, putting it in, doing the tests on the target response factor that we're interested in, which is this feedback to the atmosphere, what we're able to do is demonstrate the importance of adding new functionality, and with that comes new plant traits that have to be taken into account as well. So what I want to do is walk through then the progression of plant traits in these global models over time, and I've just taken a selection of them. I haven't put every possible plant trait up there, but enough, I think, to give you the idea of the main point that I'm trying to make. In the beginning, for the early atmosphere, ocean, GCMs, everything that you see up there was either completely absent or just implicit. And as we move to the first generation of GCMs that had this simple land boundary condition, as I already said, now we have a few things that have become explicit. They're constant, but they're explicitly represented in the model. Moving to, for example, SIB as a new generation of GCMs with a little bit of biology. Now, conductance was actually prognostic. Conductance was dynamic, as was transpiration and photosynthesis in various flavors of that model. And other things are actually community composition is in there as an explicit constant factor now. And we move forward, here's the first generation of climate carbon cycle models, and now additional things like growth and biomass and leaf area and height and reflectance and canopy cover are all now prognostic. You have to be predicting these things, and so they're dynamic. They're dynamic plant traits showing up in these climate models. And additional things, yay, roots, have shown up as an explicit factor in these, even in these early stages of the carbon climate models. And then more recently, adding the nitrogen cycle, you can see where this is going. That is, you bring in new capabilities, things that used to be explicit are now becoming prognostic, and new things come in that are now explicit but are still constant, and we're kind of working our way through this list until we have the current Earth system models, which don't have everything yet prognostic. I've highlighted a couple of things here. Plant hydraulics, that's actually not true anymore. There are some good examples now of plant hydraulics models that are more dynamic and prognostic, but specific leaf area, we don't have a model yet at the global scale, and an Earth system model that does a prediction of specific leaf area. And flowering, for example, and seed production isn't represented, as far as I know, in any of these models. So the point that I want to end with this part is that all of these models, everything that I've referenced so far, uses a PFT approach. And if you take anything away from this presentation, I'm hoping that it's this. These traits, be they implicit or explicit or prognostic, have been playing a prominent role in Earth system modeling for a long time. And there is not a dichotomy between this PFT-based and trait-based approaches. It's just a matter of degree, and we're on a path toward more dynamic. And I think this is very consistent with the presentations that we heard earlier in this session. So I was really happy that we were all kind of converging on that idea. So I'm going to spend the next, 5 minutes talking about a couple of specific examples of how we move forward based on sort of the progress that we've made to date, which I've just kind of talked through this sort of an approach in terms of improving our process representation through model data integration. We actually have a pretty detailed model in place now for how we do this new model development, where we have development that's based on new knowledge. We have multi-scale simulations and very formal uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis framework that leads to new hypotheses that hopefully then, in an ideal world, which in some ways we actually live in, leads to new observation experimentation, and finally multi-scale synthesis leads us to quantitative knowledge. So here's an example of one kind of loop through that system. This is work that's been led by Dan Rasciuto at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and also with the co-author Kachik Sargsyan at Sandia National Labs. And what they've done is they've taken 96 FluxNet sites and 68 parameters from the Acme land model, which is a derivative of the CESM that's sponsored by the Department of Energy. And they've looked at a wide range of parameter space in those 68 parameters, 96 sites, running for hundreds of years for each site. So you can see right away, we've got an enormous number of years of simulation. We could never, even on our biggest supercomputers, run all those simulations. And so what we do instead is have a polynomial chaos expansion that gives us surrogate models, and then we have a Bayesian compressive sensing that lets us be very smart about how we sampled this multi-dimensional parameter space. And for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to walk you through those equations. So, no, I'm just kidding. So in the end, what we get out of that is that of those 68 parameters, only 17 of them across all those 96 sites showed up with sensitivity that was greater than 0.2, which is some arbitrary sort of cutoff that I'm not going to explain what that means. But it's interesting that it isn't every single parameter that matters, and we can actually down select quite significantly. And this is an example of what that looks like. The really cool thing that I want you to see from this is not so much, we've looked at 3 sites here of the 96. I just wanted to point out that in addition to the main interaction, the main effect factors, we also get out of this system all of the 2-way as well as 3-way and n-way interaction factors if you care to look that deep. So there's a lot of really interesting information that we can extract from this analysis, and that's all operational now. I'll spend just 1 minute looking at this, which is to take all of those 96 sites. They're sorted now by plant functional type, and just for example, plant functional type 7 here is the temperate deciduous broadleaf tree, so lots of those. We've measured plenty of those. This is a C3 grass in PFT 13, and what this is showing is all of the parameters that showed up as significant above a certain cutoff at any of these sites. And what jumps out to me is that the plant functional types in many cases actually have a coherent picture between them that's maybe more consistent than the variation among them. Variation within them is more coherent than the variation among them. We're still working on demonstrating that, but it was encouraging to me that there is some information here that's, that the PFTs are helping us to organize. And then we're also doing some kind of environmental gradient analysis of this as well to look at, for example, how the sensitivity of sensible heat flux to variation in leaf carbon and nitrogen ratio changes as a function of temperature. So this is the kind of thing that we could actually begin to evaluate against observations from a database like TRI. And so we're beginning to do that as well. And the very, very final thing that I have to say is that with Peter Reich's group, Ethan Butler and others have helped us to move away from this idea of a single mean value for each PFT, and they've actually been generating some maps based on a combination of PFTs and environmental drivers, as well as a Bayesian framework in this work as well, that has resulted in maps with, where they're able to test through robust statistical methods what the error rates in these maps are, and kind of try to find the approaches that give us the best map. So here's a map for a specific leaf area. They've done this as well for mass-based leaf nitrogen concentration, and I'll show you also the mass-based leaf phosphorus concentration. So we're hoping that we'll be able to use this information to inject some more variation, as Peter earlier said might be a useful thing to do into our PFT framework. So the second and final conclusion is that we have this rigorous uncertainty quantification framework. It's working and it's able to steer us toward model observation details that we think will have an impact on the outcome in the model that we care about, and we're prepared to make this next step to have dynamic plant traits with environmental variation driving variation within the PFTs. Thanks.